I never thought a tree could turn into the kind of problem that quietly turns your life upside down. But in Cedar Hollow, Ohio, that's exactly what happened to me. And it started with something I used to barely notice at all. A big old oak tree sitting right on the line between my property and a rental house next door that was owned by some out-of-state management company. I actually liked that tree at first. It gave good shade over my driveway in the summer. It made the place feel a little more grounded, like the land had been there longer than any of us. But looking back now, I realize that's how these things always start. Something harmless enough that you don't act fast when you probably should. The first time I felt uneasy was early spring when I noticed the tree wasn't standing the way it used to. It had a slight lean, nothing dramatic, nothing you'd call an emergency. But if you looked at it long enough, you could see it was favoring my side of the driveway, like it was slowly choosing where it wanted to fall. I remember standing there with my coffee one morning thinking maybe it was just me imagining things, but something about it stayed in my head. So I walked over and knocked on the rental next door. Nobody answered, which wasn't unusual because the place was never really lived in, just managed. Eventually, I found a lockbox with a number on it and called it. That's when I first spoke to a guy named Darren Hayes. He sounded like he had 100 other things going on, and my tree problem was not one of them. I told him the oak was leaning toward my driveway, and I was worried it could come down on my vehicles. He said he'd send someone out to take a look. Simple enough. I thought that was the end of it. But nobody came. Weeks went by, and the tree stayed exactly the same, leaning just enough to keep bothering me, but not enough to force action from anyone else. I called again in early summer. Darren sounded a little annoyed this time, like I was exaggerating. He told me it had already been inspected and that it was structurally fine. I asked who inspected it, and he said it was a landscaping crew they contracted. I remember pausing there because that didn't sound like an arborist to me. So I asked directly if any certified tree specialist had looked at it. There was a pause on the phone, and then he said he'd double-check the report, but nothing changed after that either. No follow-up, no visit, just silence and a tree that kept leaning a little more every month, like it was slowly committing to a direction. By the time late summer rolled around, I started parking farther away from it, even though it made no logical sense. I just didn't trust it anymore. And I even joked to my neighbor across the street that one day that tree was going to owe me money. But underneath the joke, I was actually uneasy because I'd seen enough storms in Ohio to know that small problems don't stay small forever. Then October came in with one of those soft, harmless-looking storms, just a steady rain, a little wind, nothing that would make you think twice. I went to bed that night thinking about normal things, work, groceries, nothing about trees or property lines. But the next morning, everything changed. I stepped outside still half asleep, and I saw it immediately. A massive limb had come down overnight, thick as a small car, and it had landed directly on my hood. I didn't even walk at first. I just stood there trying to process it because the damage didn't match the weather at all. The hood was crushed down into the engine bay, windshield gone, metal warped like it had been stepped on, and for a moment the whole world just felt strangely quiet. Like even the birds were unsure what had just happened. I took photos without really thinking, hands shaking a little more than I wanted to admit. Then I called my insurance company, and after that I called Darren. And that's when the tone of everything shifted, because he didn't sound surprised. He sounded practiced, like he had already said this sentence before. He told me these things happen, that it was an act of God, that I should just go through my insurance and let them handle it. And something about the way he said it made me realize this wasn't going to be simple, because to him it was already closed, just another fallen branch in a system built to move on quickly. I filed the claim anyway. My insurance paid for the damage up front, but told me they would be pursuing the management company to recover the cost. And while all of that was moving through paperwork and phone calls and waiting periods, I kept looking at that tree stump of a problem still standing there next to my driveway, still leaning, still untouched, like nothing had really changed at all. That's when I decided I couldn't just leave it to insurance and hope someone else would figure it out. So I hired a certified arborist on my own, not through a contractor, not through a middle layer, just someone with real credentials and no reason to sugarcoat anything. He showed up on a Tuesday morning, walked around the tree for maybe 10 minutes, tapped the trunk a few times, took photos, notes, and then he looked at me and said something I didn't expect to hear. He said the tree wasn't just leaning, it was actively failing, root damage, internal decay, and the lean itself was accelerating, meaning it wasn't stable at all. It was in motion. He told me plainly that it was only a matter of time before a major failure happened. He wrote everything down in a formal report and left me with a copy that felt heavier than it should have. I sent that report to Darren by certified mail, along with a clear request that the hazard be addressed within 30 days. I thought at that point things would finally move, that the evidence would be enough, but when I called him a few days later, he dismissed it almost immediately, said it was just one opinion, that they'd get their own assessment and compare. And I could hear in his voice that he already believed his answer would be the one that mattered. And that's when I realized I wasn't dealing with a misunderstanding anymore. I was dealing with avoidance, and the tree was still there, leaning, waiting, and I was about to find out just how far that kind of waiting could go. After that call with Darren, I remember sitting in my truck longer than I needed to, just looking at that tree through the windshield like it had become something different overnight. Not just a piece of landscaping anymore, but a kind of silent argument that nobody wanted to finish. And the strange part was how normal everything around it still looked. Kids riding bikes down the street, someone mowing their lawn across the road. Life just going on like there wasn't a half-failed oak tree leaning over my driveway waiting for gravity to make the final decision. A few days later, I got what they called their independent assessment, and I'm not even going to pretend it surprised me. It said the tree was stable, no immediate risk, routine maintenance recommended, the kind of language that sounds confident but doesn't actually say anything useful if you've ever looked at something and known it was about to break. So now I had two reports sitting on my kitchen table that completely disagreed with each other. One from a certified arborist I paid for myself, one from a contractor the management company trusted, and somewhere in the middle of that gap was my driveway, my car, and whatever was going to happen next. I didn't argue anymore at that point. I just went straight to the city. Cedar Hollow Code Enforcement Office wasn't glamorous. Just a small building with faded signage and a front desk that looked like it had seen too many complaints to be impressed by anything. I handed them everything, photos of the crushed hood, both arborist reports, emails, notes, and I told them plainly I wasn't trying to start a fight. I just didn't want a predictable failure to turn into someone getting hurt. The inspector they sent out was a woman named Helen Mercer, older, calm, the kind of person who doesn't waste words. She walked the property line with me, looked up at the lien, didn't say much at first, just took measurements, photos, notes, and I could tell by her silence. She already didn't like what she was seeing. After maybe 15 minutes, she finally said, "Yeah, this is not something I would ignore." And that was it. No drama, no emotion, just professional confirmation that what I'd been saying all along was valid. A few days later, the city issued a formal violation notice to the property management company requiring immediate remediation within 21 days, or the city would step in directly and bill them for the work. I remember calling Darren after that because I thought maybe this would finally reset everything. But his reaction was colder than before. He told me I was escalating things unnecessarily, that the city was overreacting. And then he said something that stuck with me. He said, "You've turned a simple tree into a liability problem." And I almost laughed because from my point of view, it was already a liability problem the moment it leaned over my driveway. But I didn't say that. I just told him again that my car had already been under it once, and I wasn't interested in testing fate a second time. He said they would trim it as a temporary solution, and I told him trimming a structurally compromised tree doesn't fix root failure. He paused like he didn't like being corrected, then said their arborist disagreed, and I asked him to send that report over immediately. He said he would, but it never came, and that silence told me more than anything else he had said so far. Meanwhile, the clock was running. I started checking every few days, and the tree didn't change. Still leaning, still standing, still technically their problem, according to paperwork, but physically sitting right above my property like it was waiting for permission to collapse. Day 15 passed. Nothing. Day 18, nothing. And by day 20, I had stopped expecting them to do anything at all. It was just me watching a deadline approach that I didn't control. And then day 21 arrived, and I woke up early that morning for no real reason except I couldn't sleep. Something felt off, like the air before a storm even when the sky looks clear. And I stepped outside just in time to hear engines down the street. City. Trucks pulling in. Workers unloading equipment. No announcement. No negotiation. Just execution of the order. I stood there on my driveway while they marked the tree, and for the first time in months nobody was asking me to prove anything. They were just acting. They cut first on the property management side. large sections coming down in controlled, methodical pieces, branches hitting the ground with that deep, final sound that only heavy wood makes when it's no longer part of something alive. And within hours, the tree was no longer what it used to be. It was reduced, exposed, and clearly unstable in a way nobody could argue with anymore. But what surprised me wasn't the removal itself. It was how fast it shifted the energy of the entire situation. Like once the city stepped in, all the opinions stopped mattering, and that night I hired my own crew to finish what was left on my side. I didn't even debate it. I just wanted it gone, clean cut, no leaning shadow over my driveway, no more waiting for something to decide when it was going to fall. The crew showed up the next morning, professional, quick, no questions. They took the remaining portion down in under an hour and ground the stump before lunch for $100 and a strange kind of silence afterward, like a conversation that had finally ended after going on too long. But I knew it wasn't actually over yet. Because people like Darren don't usually accept outcomes that aren't on their terms, and sure enough. Later that afternoon he called me again, and this time he wasn't even trying to sound calm. He said I had no right to remove anything that crossed the property line without permission, and I remember just looking at the empty space where the tree used to be and thinking how odd it was that something so dangerous could still be argued over like it belonged to someone more than physics itself. I didn't argue back. I just sent him the invoice for the removal and went back inside, not expecting anything from it. But 3 weeks later, something showed up in the mail that I didn't expect. Not from him, not from the company directly, but from their insurance carrier. A full payment covering everything, no explanation attached, no apology, just resolution through a system that had decided the numbers mattered more than the conversation. And that's when I started to understand that this whole thing was never really about a tree. It was about how long people can ignore a problem before the system forces them to acknowledge it. After that check arrived, I didn't even open it right away. I just left it on the kitchen table for a while like it was something I needed distance from. Not because I didn't know what it was, but because it felt too clean compared to everything it came from. Months of phone calls, reports, arguments, waiting, watching, all of that reduced into a single piece of paper that said the system had reached a conclusion and now it was done. And the strange part was how anticlimactic that feeling was. Like I had expected some kind of emotional shift, relief, or satisfaction, or even anger. But what I actually felt was just quiet. The kind of quiet you notice only after something stressful has been removed, and you realize how much mental space it was taking up without you fully admitting it. I eventually walked outside that evening just out of habit and stood where my driveway met the street, looking at the empty space where that oak used to lean over everything, and I realized I had been subconsciously angling my car away from that spot for so long that it almost felt unnatural to park normally now that I could. Like my body had learned a rule my mind didn't need anymore. A few days later, I drove past the property without thinking about it until I was already there, and I slowed down automatically expecting to still see the same old lean, same shadow over the driveway. But it was just gone. Not even a dramatic scar left behind. Just open space and trimmed ground and the absence of something that had once felt permanent. And that's when it hit me how quickly something can go from being a constant worry to just a memory that no longer has physical weight. About a week after that, I ran into Darren at a hardware store on the edge of town, completely unplanned. One of those moments where two people who share history end up in the same aisle pretending they don't feel it. He saw me first and hesitated for a second like he was deciding whether to acknowledge me or keep walking. Then he came over anyway and said something like, "I guess that's all settled now." And I nodded because there wasn't much else to say at that point. And then he added, almost defensively, "You pushed that pretty far," like the outcome still needed to be justified. And I remember looking at him for a moment, not angry, just tired in a way that doesn't really leave you. And I said, "I didn't push anything. I just documented what was already happening." And there was a pause after that where neither of us really had anywhere to take the conversation. Because the truth is we weren't arguing about the same thing. He was talking about process, I was talking about risk, and those two things don't always meet cleanly in real life. He nodded once, not agreeing exactly, but acknowledging the conversation had reached its limit. And then he walked away down the aisle like people do, when they don't want to keep standing in a moment that's already uncomfortable. And that was it. No resolution between us as people, just closure and paperwork and distance. Over the next few weeks, life just slowly went back to normal. The kind of normal you don't appreciate until something disrupts it for long enough. Mornings felt lighter, driving into my driveway stopped being a calculation, and even the sound of wind through the trees stopped triggering that small instinctive check over my shoulder. But even then, every now and then I still caught myself glancing at the empty space out of habit, like my mind was waiting for a problem that had already been resolved. One evening I was sitting outside and my neighbor called over asking if I thought it was worth all of it. All the reports, the city involvement, the time, and I didn't answer immediately because the honest answer isn't simple. Because on one hand it was just a tree, but on the other hand it was also months of ignored warnings, a destroyed car, and a situation where responsibility only showed up when it was forced to. So I told him finally that it wasn't really about the tree. It was about what happens when something is clearly unsafe and people assume time will fix it instead of action, and he just nodded like that made sense in a way people don't usually say out loud. And after he went back inside, I stayed out there a little longer, thinking about how most conflicts don't end with a dramatic win or loss. They just end when the system finally catches up to reality. And I guess if there's anything I learned standing in that empty space where the oak used to be, it's that ignoring risk doesn't erase it. It just delays the moment someone has to deal with it. And usually that delay costs more than anyone expects. So if you're watching this, I'm curious what you think. Was this the right way for it to play out? Or should I have backed off earlier and just accepted the risk? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I honestly think stories like this look completely different depending on where you're standing. And if you want more real-life situations like this, subscribe, because sometimes the quiet problems are the ones that take the longest to resolve, and the ones you remember the most when they're finally gone.